In this lecture, we'll continue talking about the sound wave parameter. We'll talk about the wavelength, the period, and the frequency, and how they related to each other and how they related to the propagation speed. My name is Joe, and I help people understand ultrasound physics and pass the SPI exam. The distance from the start of the cycle to the start of the next cycle, this we call it a wavelength. And we use abbreviation of lambda for the wavelength, and we measure it using a unit of millimeter or any unit for distance. The time from the start of the cycle to the start of the next cycle, we call it period, and we use the unit of second or any unit of time to measure the period. Frequency is a number of cycles in 1 second. For example, if the time from this cycle to this cycle is 3 seconds, how much is the frequency? So we'll count how many cycles we have. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We have 6 cycles in 3 seconds. So the frequency equal to 6 cycles divided by 3, it will equal to 2 hertz. If we have 6 cycles in 3 seconds, so 3 seconds have 6 cycles, so how much is the period? The period will equal 3 seconds divided by the number of cycles, it will equal to half second. We can tell that the frequency and the period are reciprocally related. That means that the period is equal to 1 divided by the frequency, and the frequency will equal 1 divided by the period. And the period multiplied by the frequency will equal to 1. Now we'll understand the relationship between the wavelength, the period, and the frequency, and how they are related to the propagation speed. We learned before that the propagation speed depends only on the medium. And how it depends on the medium? It's inversely related to the density and directly related to the stiffness. The wavelength is dependent on the medium and the source. And how it depends on the medium? It depends on the medium because it's directly related to the propagation speed. Why directly related to the propagation speed? Because the wavelength is equal to the propagation speed divided by the frequency. And because it divided by the frequency, that's why also the wavelength, it depends on the source. How it depends on the source? Because it's inversely related to the frequency and also directly related to the period. How directly related to the period? Because the wavelength also equal to the propagation speed multiplied by the period. This equation is the same as this equation. Why? Because the frequency is reciprocally related to the period. So if we take the frequency from here, we can put the period here. Also, the wavelength depends on the source in other way. How? Because we know that the wavelength is equal to twice the active element. BZT, or the active element thickness, is equal to half the wavelength. So the wavelength will equal to twice the BZT. So now we learn that the wavelength is dependent on the medium because it depends on the speed, and also depend on the source because it depends on the frequency, which is depend on the source, because the frequency coming from the transducer, by changing the transducer, you can change the frequency, and also you can change the period. That's why it depends on the source. And also depend on the source in other way because it's equal to twice the active element thickness. Next, we'll talk about the period and the frequency. The period and the frequency are depend only on the source. How it depends on the source? When you change the transducer, you are changing the frequency. And when you change the frequency, you also change the period. Why? Because the period is equal to the 1 over the frequency, and the frequency equal 1 over the period, and the period multiplied by the frequency will equal to 1. Conclusion here that the frequency and the period are depending only on the source. How the frequency depends on the source? Because each transducer has its own frequency. And when the frequency changes, the period it changes because the period is reciprocally related to the frequency. For the propagation speed, it depends only on the medium. The wavelengths depend on the source and depend on the medium. Depend on the source because it depends on the period and the frequency from this equation. And it depends on the medium because it also depends on the propagation speed from the same equation. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.